Today's scripture lesson is from Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And this text is inspired by Good as New translation. After a few days, Jesus returned to Capernaum, and people heard he was back home. So many turned up, they blocked the doorway. When Jesus was sharing with them his message, 4 people came along, carrying a paralyzed man. They could not get through the crowd, so they went up to the flat roof, tore off part of the roof above where Jesus was teaching, and lowered the man down through the hole on his stretcher. When Jesus saw their trust, he said to the man, "Friend, your wrongdoings are forgiven." And some of the experts in the old books who were sitting there thought to themselves, "Who does he think he is? Only God can forgive sins." And Jesus knew that they were thinking something like that. So he said to them, "Why do you think like this? What do you think it is easier to say? Your wrongdoings are forgiven? Or get on your feet, pick up your stretcher, and walk? But so that you know that we can forgive wrongs here on earth," Jesus turned to the paralyzed man and said, "Get on your feet, take your stretcher, and go home." And the man stood up, picked up his stretcher, and with all eyes on him, he walked off. Everyone was amazed and thanked God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this before." The word of God.
So today is World AIDS Day, and I thought that it'll be appropriate for us to talk about how faith community here in this church came in contact with AIDS and how it kept faithful through AIDS crisis in this broader community. I vividly remember when I first heard about AIDS, and that was through no other source but Voice of America from Washington, D.C. It was forbidden to listen to international broadcasts. So I had it on a pillow and was listening to it. And then my first direct encounter was in Edinburgh when I went to study there. And the Church of Scotland and the whole Edinburgh community was really preparing and struggling. It was 30 years ago this year. But I'm curious, you as those who remember this church at that time, when did you first become aware of AIDS epidemics? Nora? Use microphone.
Actually, I first became aware of AIDS through the news, through television. Every magazine had it on, and it was horrifying, but it didn't feel personal. And it wasn't until actually Carl Bassan, who was a gay man, extremely faithful, and he made Rutgers open up and talk about what was really going on. And Rutgers was not such an open place at that time. We were pretty conservative. We had many gay members. I was here back in the 60s. And you knew they were gay, but no one ever spoke about it. It was unspoken. But with the AIDS crisis and with Carl, who refused to let us turn away, we became aware.
And Laura?
I was at West Park at the time, West Park Church in the early 80s, and West Park was the first more light church in the country, and so we were very much involved with the gay community. And I remember news from California that there was this strange illness happening in the gay community. And then a member of our choir became very, very sick. And that was the moment when we came face to face personally with AIDS.
Yeah. And then when it came into that full expression, I heard you about really, like struggling with it here in this congregation.
Yeah, the period of the mid-'80s to really the time when Byron Schaefer was installed as minister, we had many different ministers here at Rutgers. And each one gave amazing contributions to the community, but it was not a time of stable leadership in the congregation. So it was that and plus the AIDS crisis made it a very difficult period when and yet the congregation really rallied. We had individuals in the congregation who created an atmosphere of welcome here. I think we're going to talk a bit about Mark Coonrod when he first came in, I think, 1983, 1984. And Nora, maybe you want to tell us a little bit, remembering Mark.
So Mark Coonrod, I love Mark Coonrod. He was quite a character and full of life and energy. But in fact, he had AIDS and he was dying of AIDS. Did we know it? No. Mark would not talk about it. I never really was sure what was going on, except that for week after week after week for months, Mark either preached himself on healing and how you needed to believe, and if you believed strongly enough, you would heal yourself. And he had many preachers come in and preach on the same subject. And yet we didn't know, and this is so sad, that Mark was preaching to himself and maybe was trying to reach out to us in some way to help him. But we didn't know, he couldn't say it out loud, and he died of AIDS. And no one knew that.
And meanwhile, there were many different activities sponsored by church. I was really touched by your story about, like bringing the healthy food, or how did you call it?
Macrobiotics?
Well, the Healing Kitchen began, and the Healing Kitchen is actually the precursor to the Thursday night meal program. And it was macrobiotic food and helping people through transition in terms of their diet and trying everything they could to be healthy, and that was Mark.
And we had God's Love We Deliver here for a while for the same reason, and it was to reach out to those with AIDS.
Right, yeah. It started at West Park with Genghis Stone, and that also, it's interesting, that also continues, but in a different format than those early days.
And wasn't there also a Lambda coming here at that time?
Yes, I think you were telling me earlier that, and you refreshed my memory, that the Lambda AA was on the east side, and it was Mark Coonrod and George Nowicki, whom some of you will remember very well, who invited the Lambda AA to come here to Rutgers, where it has been ever since. And also front runners came here, and there were workshops on anger and forgiveness and healing, yes, at that time. So we were trying to respond, but the responses, the ideas for the responses came from the congregation, and it was an amazing thing. It was really an amazing period in that way.
You know what I think was the most amazing? At that time, no one really knew what we were dealing with.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
And there was tremendous fear. You know, you couldn't touch someone if they had AIDS. What would happen to you? What if you drank out of the same glass that someone drank out of? And the one big thing I think that happened here was you didn't feel that fear. No, people reached out and touched each other. They talked to each other. And I think that was the biggest thing. It was a place people could come. And more people did start coming, actually, and I think for that reason.
It was through this serious crisis that actually congregation opened up.
Yes.
You know, just hearing you about Lambda and Frontrunners and all other, and Carl, I think, still has a plaque on one of the columns here. It was just...
And the chalice, the communion chalice.
Well, the communion chalice, you notice when we have communion, you can have it in your seats or you can come up. And Andrew did tell us this before, but the session decided that having the chalice where everyone could come was a sign of God's love and that we weren't afraid and that we could all share a common cup. And that's how that started. And I just want to say something about John Lembo.
Yeah.
John Lembo was Carl's partner, and John did have AIDS. And he didn't die until a few years ago, actually. But he did die of AIDS, and it wasn't pleasant. But what John did was he could sew. That was one of his great skills, sew and knit, and he often knitted things for children in the congregation. But he worked on the AIDS quilt, and he made a square from Rutgers, and it was on the AIDS quilt, and then the AIDS quilt came here, and they were displayed, some of them, in Rutgers.
And all of this was happening under serious pressure of prejudice in the society, just thinking about it, you know, and inner loss. You know, I still remember when I first heard from you, Laura, that there were times when there were hardly a week without a funeral.
That's right. Yeah, and that was a time when there weren't installed ministers here. We had some interims. John Sisley was very active in this, and I was asked to come down to Rutgers in 1989 and was here during that period. And as you say, there were funerals of church members and funerals of the greater Rutgers Church. Even though people in the Lambda AA, the Healing Kitchen, and the Frontrunners, they were not members of Rutgers, but this was their church. And so they turned to Rutgers for the memorial services and the funerals. I remember, I don't remember a lot. It's a kind of a fog because there were so many services. Some of the services were just a few people, and some, the congregation on the balcony was filled. Some people here will remember Burton Taylor. Burton Taylor was one of the first people that I recognized with the Kaposia sarcoma, which are the lesions. And you began to see lesions on people's face and neck, and it was very, and it attacked the whole body. There was a memorial service for a friend of Burton's, and Burton was very, very weak, and he wanted to speak, and he was going to come up the stairs, and then he just decided to sit on the steps. I don't know if any of you remember that, who were here. And there he memorialized his friend. And the next week, Burton died, and we were here memorializing him. There were so many stories. George Nowicki, who was an elder in this church and contributed so much, his family became a part of this church. And that was, I will remember the healing moment. It was difficult for George's father to embrace the fact that George was gay. But before he died, we were in George's apartment with his partner. We were surrounding the bed where George was laying, and his father, I can't remember the words, but there was this amazing moment when his father embraced George physically and emotionally. And all I could think of was, yes, George is dying, but healing is taking place here. And now George's father's ashes are inurned with his son George here at Rutgers Church. So there were those many moments that were difficult and solemn, and yet the community of affiliation. In a number of cases, when people died in New York City, they were, came from other places in the country, and so often the body would be sent home, but the service would be here because it was the family of affiliation that came together to speak truth and to remember and to give thanks for those people.
And as difficult and bitter that experience was, I can still feel like the strength from that period.
Yeah.
And how this community of faith was shaped by that experience, and spiritually and physically also.
Mm-hmm.
And that is also why I picked that biblical reading for this Sunday. This is not a traditional reading for the first Advent, but I thought that it is appropriate because it opens up the roof when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there are all these accusations of wrongdoings, or sins, as it is in the reading, and that Jesus is dismissing it or forgiving, but at the same time paying attention somewhere else,
Mm-hmm.
and showing to people that something else is more important. Sometimes you see that the crowds are actually an impediment. It's a problem because the true people cannot get to where it is important. But at the same time, I see this community as those who carried that person on a stretcher. I see Rutgers as bringing that healing. And interestingly there, Jesus is saying that he is healing for their faith.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's right there. And that is how I perceive this community of faith, as bringing healing, not necessarily to those who were suffering, but bringing healing to the broader society and making treatment possible. Because you rejected here to ostracize, to alienate, to the opposite. You welcomed and opened. That's how I see and understand Carl, who, with that recognition, stop being shy. Am I right? Or was it?
Carl was never shy. But he had a fire to him.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl just refused. I mean, we had to go anyway. We had to do this because Carl was here, and Carl said, "Get up. Get up. What are you doing?" He himself worked on a hotline for, young gay men who were thinking of committing suicide during this time. And so he manned the phones. He didn't tell us that. You know, he never told you what he was doing, but he did tell us what to do. Get up.
You know, in the Mark passage, there's the sudden word about sin and Jesus, you know, forgiving sin. And in my feeling, I feel like the sin was the alienation that people had in response to the disease, and the shunning, and the families who were torn apart, and that, I believe, is now, it has been forgiven.
Yeah.
That's the sin.
And the churches which were churches which were brave enough to stand up and say, not in our midst, I think is just and prophetic.
Right.
And very powerful. And for that, I think that we should be thankful for those who served here, who passed away, but brought that understanding to all of us, and who are remembered today.
I think we also have to be mindful that AIDS is not over, that people are still living with AIDS. In our country, I think we are, you know, it has become a chronic illness rather than a death sentence. But in many parts of the world, of course, it still is, leads to death, particularly in Africa, in parts of Southeast Asia. And we still have to do what we can to make sure that medication is given to everyone at no cost, may I say.
And with that, I thank you very much for joining me in discussion, but I will ask you to now help me to pray with the whole congregation in a non-traditional but very meaningful way. And I have here red ribbons as a sign of prayer. And so I'll ask you to first pin your prayer on your chest, and then I should do it as well. And we'll take these pins now to people in the congregation. So pray with us. And may these ribbons we are now wearing be in memory of those who passed away, but also as our commitment to openness and love and support of all those who are infected around the world, and in our commitment to strive against AIDS. Amen.